I've been told my whole life that I'm lucky. Lucky to have a husband like Victor, lucky to live in a comfortable home, lucky to raise two beautiful children. To the outside world, my life looked almost perfect, the kind of picture people admired from afar. Neighbors would smile and wave when we passed by, whispering to themselves, "What a perfect family." But behind the closed doors of our neatly painted house, my reality was anything but perfect. Victor, my husband, was not the man people believed him to be. In public, he was charming, attentive, even affectionate. He had this way of making everyone around him feel like he was the most generous man alive. But behind that mask was someone cold, controlling, and manipulative. When I first married him, I thought I had found stability. I was young, hopeful, and full of dreams. I wanted to be a teacher, to work with children, to make a difference in their lives. But Victor made it clear, very early on, that my place was in the home. I still remember the first time I mentioned applying for a teaching job. He laughed, not cruelly but dismissively, like I was a child who had said something ridiculous. "You don't need to work, Elena. I provide everything. Why would you waste your time with a job?" At first, I convinced myself that he was right. Maybe this was what marriage was supposed to be: compromise, sacrifice. But little by little, those sacrifices turned into a cage I couldn't escape. Victor never needed to shout to control me. His silence was far worse. If I did something he didn't approve of, he would stop talking to me for days. I would walk around the house on eggshells, begging for him to acknowledge me, desperate for the tension to end. Money was another weapon. I was given a household allowance, and every expense I made was scrutinized. If I bought a dress, he'd call me wasteful. If I spent extra on groceries, he'd accuse me of being irresponsible. Eventually, I stopped buying anything for myself. I stopped asking. I stopped wanting. Even in front of our children, he made sure I remembered my place. If I made a decision without consulting him, he'd correct me in front of them, making me feel small, like I wasn't even capable of managing my own life. The hardest part was the mask I had to wear in public. At family gatherings, Victor would hold my hand, smile at me, and shower me with compliments. At work events, he'd boast about me, how I was the perfect wife, how I kept everything running smoothly at home. And I would smile. I would laugh. I would nod. But inside, I was crumbling. Each time I played along, I felt another piece of myself slip away. One evening, after a long day, I burned dinner. Just a simple mistake. But Victor made sure to humiliate me in front of our children. His tone was sharp, dismissive, as though I had failed at the only thing I was good for. Later that night, I sat alone in my room, staring into the mirror. The woman looking back at me felt like a stranger. My eyes were tired, my smile forced, my spirit dimmed. And for the first time, I whispered to myself, "This can't be my life forever. I duo." It was in that moment that something inside me shifted. I didn't know how or when, but I promised myself that one day I would find a way to take my life back. And though I remained silent on the outside, a quiet flame began to flicker inside me, the beginning of my awakening. The thing about living in a cage is that you don't always notice the bars until you finally reach out and your hand hits metal. That's how my life with Victor felt. For years, I convinced myself that what we had was normal, that every marriage had struggles, that maybe I just needed to be more patient, more accommodating. But deep down, I knew. I knew something wasn't right. It started with small things. A few hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. Receipts tucked away in the pocket of his suit pants. For dinners at restaurants I'd never been to. And then there was the smell, the faint trace of perfume on his shirts. Not mine. Never mine. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just being paranoid. Victor had drilled it into my head for so long that I was overly emotional, that I overthought everything. so I second-guessed myself constantly. But the signs became harder and harder to ignore. One night, Victor told me he had a late meeting at work. That wasn't unusual. He often stayed late, and I had learned not to ask questions. But that night, something in me shifted. I don't know why, maybe it was intuition, maybe it was exhaustion, but I decided to call his office. The receptionist answered, and when I asked if Victor was still there, she hesitated. Then she said, "Oh, he left hours ago." My chest tightened, but I thanked her politely, hung up, and sat in silence. My mind raced, trying to piece together the lies, but the only sound I could hear was my heartbeat, pounding louder and louder. When Victor came home later that night, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his, I wanted to scream, but I didn't. Instead, I asked, gently, almost playfully, "How was your meeting?" He didn't even blink. It was fine. Long. Exhausting. The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that for a split second I doubted myself. But that doubt quickly hardened into suspicion. From that day on, everything changed. I began to watch him carefully, quietly. I memorized the way his phone would light up at odd hours. I noticed how he suddenly became protective of his laptop, closing it the moment I entered the room. But Victor was clever. He wasn't sloppy. He made sure the mask stayed perfectly intact in front of family, friends, even our children. To them, he was still the devoted husband, the hard-working father, and I was the loyal wife who supported him without question. What they didn't see was the tension simmering underneath. Every smile I forced at a dinner party. Every moment I bit my tongue to keep the peace. Every silent car ride where I stared out the window, wondering who he had been with before coming home. Whenever I tried to hint at my suspicions, Victor turned it back on me. "Are you really doing this, Elena? After everything I provide for you?" "You're imagining things again. You always blow things out of proportion. Maybe you should focus on being a better wife instead of accusing me." The words cut deep, because a part of me believed them. That was his power. He knew how to twist reality until I questioned my own sanity. But deep down, a stubborn voice inside me whispered, "You're not crazy. He's hiding something." One evening, I was folding laundry when I came across a hotel receipt tucked inside his jacket pocket. It wasn't for a business trip. The hotel was only 20 minutes away from our home. I sat on the bed holding that receipt in my hands, staring at the date and time printed on it. He had lied to my face that night. Lied to our children. Lied to everyone. And that was when I knew the cracks in the foundation of our marriage were no longer just cracks. The whole structure was beginning to crumble. I didn't confront him then. Not yet. Because something inside me told me to wait, to watch, to gather proof. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt something else, something sharper. A quiet rage that whispered, if he thinks he's playing a game, he has no idea who he's dealing with. When I found that hotel receipt, it was like someone had finally flipped a switch inside me. For years, I had played the role of the obedient wife, keeping quiet, brushing off my instincts, swallowing my doubts. But that night, sitting on the edge of my bed with that slip of paper trembling in my hands, I realized something. I wasn't powerless. Victor thought he was in control, that he was the master of manipulation. But what he didn't realize was that every lie he told, every sneaky move he made, was giving me ammunition, and I was ready to start collecting. The next morning, I watched him get ready for work, adjusting his tie in the mirror as if nothing was wrong. He kissed me on the cheek and said, "I'll be home late tonight. Another meeting." My blood boiled. Another meeting? I almost laughed, but instead, I smiled, nodded, and said, "Of course. Be careful." Inside, I was screaming, but I kept my mask firmly in place. Because now I had a new role to play, not the clueless wife, but the silent investigator. The first step was simple. His phone. Victor guarded it like a hawk, always face down on the table. always with a password I didn't know. But one night, when he fell asleep on the couch, I took a chance. I tried his birthday, no. Our anniversary, no. Then I tried something ridiculous, almost out of spite, his mother's birthday. And just like that, the phone unlocked. My hand shook as I scrolled through his messages. Most of them were cleared, like he had taken the time to delete entire conversations. But people slip up, and Victor, for all his arrogance, was no different. There it was, a thread with someone saved under the name Carlos Work. Only the texts didn't read like work. They read like something else entirely. Last night was perfect. Can't wait to see you again. You make me feel alive, Victor. She'll never give you what I can. My stomach dropped. I had the proof. But instead of breaking down, I felt an eerie calm settle over me. From that moment on, I became obsessed with patterns. I started writing everything down in a notebook every time he came home late, every excuse he made, every random work trip that didn't add up. And the more I observed, the clearer it became. Victor wasn't just careless, he was arrogant. He believed so deeply in his own lies that he thought I'd never question them. But I was questioning everything. I checked our bank statements, tracing charges he couldn't explain, expensive dinners, luxury gifts that never reached me, hotel stays billed as business. Every discovery added fuel to the fire building inside me. Then came the night when I finally saw her. Victor had claimed he was working late again, but I followed him. My heart pounded as I parked a few streets away from the restaurant and watched him through the window. And there she was, young, glamorous, with a laugh that rang out even from a distance. She leaned across the table, touching his hand, while he smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the audacity. He was parading her in public like our marriage was nothing but a prop. That night, as I drove home, with tears streaming down my face, I promised myself something. I will not be his victim. I will not let him humiliate me in silence. He wants to play games? Fine. But I'm going to play better. What Victor didn't know was that his lies had transformed me. I wasn't his submissive wife anymore. I was his shadow, following him silently, recording his every move. And while he thought he was living a double life without consequence, I was already planning the moment his entire house of cards would come crashing down. Because the evidence I was gathering wasn't just proof for me. It was going to be the weapon I'd use to destroy him. When you see the person who hurt you acting like nothing's wrong, rage bubbles up like a storm you can't drink away. For a moment, I let that storm sit inside me, hot, roaring, dangerous. Then I did something calmer and far more ruthless. I planned. I took the little notebook I'd been filling with times and receipts, and I treated it like a ledger of war. This was no longer about catching him in a lie. It was about building a case. Evidence followed logic, dates, places, who, what, and how. If you want a thing to stick in court or public conscience, you make it airtight. You make it simple. You make people with power see it and not be able to ignore it. My first tactical move was to secure copies of everything I could get my hands on without tipping him off. I set up a separate email, anonymous, not linked to any of our accounts, and began forwarding screenshots to it from my phone. Texts, the bank charges, the little receipts he'd left in his coat. Every screenshot got a timestamp, a short note, and was saved in at least 2 places. I learned that day that organization isn't just for accountants. It's for survival. There were small victories. The bank charges that had felt like faint shadows in my head suddenly looked monstrous on paper. Consignment shops in a district he never visited. Hotel names I'd never heard before. Gift purchases to unfamiliar accounts. The hotel receipt I'd found the first night? It wasn't an isolated blip. It was part of a pattern. Every discovery sharpened the picture. Every discovery hardened me. I pulled one quiet favor after another. I had a cousin who worked at the municipal records office. She knew how to find property transactions and business registrations that didn't broadcast themselves to the general public. I asked her to check a name Victor had used on one suspicious charge. She texted me back in the middle of the night. There's a shell company linked to that address. 2 properties. One under a woman's maiden name. Nothing listed publicly, like someone was hiding it. That was the first real twist. He hadn't only slipped into an affair. He had constructed infrastructure around it. A place, a money route, plausible deniability. He'd built an alternate life with its own accounting. Then came the next reveal, and it hit me like cold rain. I had convinced myself Victor clumsily hid his tracks. I imagined receipts and old-fashioned secrecy. But he had friends who were more careful, an underground of favors, lawyers who closed their eyes. That shell company was tied to a corporate card issued for consulting. Consulting for whom? The trail pointed to a consulting firm run by one of his longtime colleagues, someone who'd been quietly friendly to me at our anniversary party, smiling across a table as if nothing had been planned. I started arranging small, controlled tests. If he left his laptop unlocked, and he sometimes did when he thought I was asleep, I copied logs into a USB drive. If he called someone and hung up, I checked his calendar for follow-ups. If hotel charges appeared, I cross-checked the dates with corporate training days. Every time I found a match, I wrote it down and let the sensation settle. This cannot be explained away as coincidence. But planning is not all spreadsheets and quiet snooping. There's a darker edge. The emotional labor of watching the person you loved shrink into someone you barely recognize. I caught myself staring at his shoes in the hallway, wondering when they had learned to walk so far from the woman who had made him tea on winter nights. I took one long look at his framed photograph on the mantel, his carefully composed smile, and realized my former grief had turned almost feral. I used it to sharpen my memory and to keep me from wavering on the nights when cowardice felt like an easier option. The next play was riskier. I needed proof that linked him and the woman in a way that couldn't be written off as hearsay, and I needed it without confrontation. I hired a private investigator. Not the gutter runner you see on television, but a discreet investigator recommended by a lawyer I'd consulted. We discussed scope. The investigator would track movements, collect video evidence, and verify ownership of that shell company. Professional, legal, unambiguous. I remembered the day the first surveillance footage arrived like a snapshot that refused to be unmade. The file name on my laptop was innocuous. Serve 417 MOV, but the image inside was explosive. There he was, Victor, hands tucked into his coat pockets, laughing as he opened the door to an apartment with a balcony overlooking the river. A woman came out behind him, hair loose, hand in his. They both moved with that intimacy that kills slow trust. The camera angle caught the building number clearly, the same that had appeared on the lease documents we'd pulled through my cousin. When I clicked pause, I could see the way he looked at her, something I hadn't felt in years. I watched the clip 3 times, then forwarded it to the anonymous email, to the investigator's secure folder, and to the lawyer. I wrote on the margin in my notebook, evidence surveillance apartment 22, B4, over 17, Victor Lawson, with woman possible alias. The word possible alias felt tiny beneath the enormity of what it meant. There was an unexpected twist I didn't expect to feel. Pity. For a breath, I felt sorry for the man who'd tried to erase me. The man with secrets wrapped so carefully he believed they gave him power. That pity lasted exactly as long as it took me to close the laptop and set the wheels turning toward action. Because evidence is only powerful if you use it, and I had to decide how public I wanted the unraveling to be. A quiet legal route? A scorched earth public reveal? Both had costs. Both had consequences that might ricochet in ways I couldn't fully measure. I made a decision I'd come to rely on throughout this ordeal. Move in measured steps, expose where necessary, and never give him the chance to spin a narrative that made me look unstable or vengeful. The investigator reported back with one more detail that felt like a slap. The woman, the one laughing on the balcony, had a professional profile under a different name. But the investigator had found photos that tied that name to Melissa Hart, the junior marketing assistant who'd been at the company holiday party, the same Melissa who had smiled at Victor across the table while I pretended not to notice. At that, the room spun for a second. Anger came. Yes, hot, public anger streaked with humiliation, but there was something colder and more methodical now. A plan crystallized. If this affair had been a private lie, it was now a public web. If he'd thought he was clever, he hadn't counted on my patience or my ability to connect the dots. I closed the notebook and placed the surveillance clip in 3 different secure drives. I copied the bank records to a legal inbox and marked an appointment with my lawyer for the next morning. Before I left the study that night, I pressed my palm to the photograph of us from years before, the way our hands had intertwined, youthful and trusting. I whispered something I never thought I'd say aloud. You started this. I will finish it. On my terms. Outside, the streetlights blinked against a soft rain. Inside, the house felt different. Not empty, but electric with plans. I slept badly, as sleep rarely came to those whose trunks of truth begin to bulge at the seams. At dawn, my phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. Be careful. You're stirring a hornet's nest. I stared at those 4 words and felt the first real shiver of fear. Then I smiled, because stirring a hornet's nest leaves stings, but it also exposes the nest's location, and I now knew exactly where to strike.
Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this, go watch the one of the left and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel for more tales of triumph over injustice and a saga of ultimate revenge.